Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. Thank you, Ted, for setting the groundwork so well. Thank you, Congresswoman Eshoo, for joining us here. Thank you, Debbie, for organizing today's event, and thank you all for being here. As Ted said, it really is terrific to see from just how full this room is what the level of energy and interest is in confronting this problem of out-of-control corporate power that we have in America today. Free Speech for People is a national, nonpartisan organization founded on the day of the Citizens United decision 3.5 years ago. The bulk of our mission is to help lead the fight to overturn Citizens United and an earlier case known as Buckley versus Vallejo. Buckley versus Vallejo, which was decided in 1976, essentially said that political campaign spending is a form of constitutionally protected free speech, and so it cannot be limited by law. It is laughable on its face, but it's been the law of the land for my adult life and frankly been a really destructive force on our democracy. What it basically does is privileges the wealthy few over everyone else. Makes it so that if you're Meg Whitman, you have a shot at higher office, but if you're, Jane Q. Public, good luck with that bake sale. Unfortunately. Citizens United decided in 2010, of course, said that corporations have the same constitutional rights, First Amendment rights, as people. And that ruling is best known for its practical effect, which was to open the floodgates to unrestrained political spending, the development of super PACs, the explosion of 501c4 groups. So it has had a hugely detrimental impact on our campaign finance system. It blew the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act that so many of us worked to pass in 2002 right out of the water and basically said anything goes. The other thing that Citizens United did was it was the most extreme extension of the corporate constitutional rights doctrine that Ted sketched out so clearly. And it extended a corporate veto over this growing doctrine which has established a corporate veto over so many of our laws. Ted talked primarily about a corporate veto in the practical sense of, if ExxonMobil, or more specifically, if Chevron comes into our last elections as they did with a $2.5 million corporate campaign gift, which was previously illegal. They can have a huge impact on the race and scare off challengers and scare existing representatives away from taking stands in the public interest for fear of alienating these potential corporate opponents, for fear of drawing an advertising onslaught against them in their next election. But what's lesser known is that the notion that corporations have constitutional rights has also had a more direct effect, as in effect a corporate veto over public interest laws. There's an example that I like to cite which goes back to before Citizens United, but is a core example of exactly this problem. The Amistoy case in Vermont was a case in which Vermonters decided that they wanted to have labeling of their dairy products if the dairy products were produced from cows that had been raised and treated with bovine growth hormone. You could understand a small agricultural community-based state like Vermont really wanting to know what's in their dairy products. Dairy, of course, is a huge part of the Vermont economy. So they passed a law that said, if you're producing dairy products for sale in Vermont, you have to simply tell us on the label whether these cows have been treated with bovine growth hormone. Public interest, democratically enacted law. This is what our democratic system is supposed to enable. Well, what happened was that the Vermont Dairy Council, if I remember the entity correctly, took the state of Vermont to court and said that the corporation has a constitutional right not, as part of their free speech rights, not to disclose on the label whether or not these cows had been so treated with bovine growth hormone. So in effect, this is a direct corporate veto over our public interest laws. When corporations have constitutional rights, what happens is the law may come into conflict with a claim of a constitutional right, and because constitutional rights are so powerful, they embody the sacred values that define America. They're basically our national DNA. They have trump power in the courts to overturn any law that comes into conflict with them. So it doesn't basically matter what laws we pass if corporations can wield this veto power to throw out any law that they find inconvenient to their bottom line. This has also happened in respect to cigarette labeling. Corporations have used the same claim of corporate constitutional rights not to speak when they choose not to invalidate laws calling for graphic health warnings on cigarette packages and to overturn laws banning cigarette billboards within a certain radius of our public schools. So it's really quite reprehensible, the effects of this doctrine. And that, in our view, is really the core of what Citizens United is about. It's known for its effect on political campaign spending. The campaign spending really is mostly goes back to Buckley versus Vallejo with an extension as a result of Citizens United. But Citizens United is really, in our view, about the doctrine that corporations have constitutional rights, a false, fabricated, fictitious, and really, really dangerous idea, which we have to overturn. And since both of these cases were passed by the Supreme Court, were decided by the Supreme Court, Buckley versus Vallejo and Citizens United, the only way that we can overcome them, unless we're willing to sit and wait another generation or two for the makeup of the Supreme Court to change and for them to change their minds, as prescribed in the Constitution under Article 5, is for we the people to stand up and say no. This is a democracy. We the people have the ultimate say here. And under Article 5, we can amend the Constitution to say and make it clear exactly what it does say. We need to have political equality for all and government of, for, and by the people. We've got to amend the Constitution again now. And to overturn Buckley, we need an amendment that says that Congress and the states have the authority to limit campaign gifts and campaign spending in all categories. And to overturn Citizens United, what we need is a constitutional amendment that says that corporations simply do not have constitutional rights as if they were people. Categorical. Well, those applause are terrific, and they make my next point beautifully, which is what's so great about this is how strongly people support this idea. So, and you're all a great demonstration of that. Ted touched on some of the polling on this, but there's really even more dramatic polling. Our polling shows that 79% of Americans across the board support a constitutional amendment to make it clear that corporations don't have constitutional rights. And that includes 68% of Republicans, as well as 82% of Democrats and 82% of independents and 87% of Democrats. That's almost 4 in 5 Americans. It also shows that 66% of small business owners see Citizens United as bad for small businesses because it gives the big guys with the corporate advantages the right to run roughshod over everybody else. Better still, we are making serious progress toward enacting an amendment. We've come remarkably far in 3.5 years, especially when you consider the scale of the challenge. Article 5 of the Constitution says that we can amend the Constitution by getting 2/3 of Congress plus 3/4 of the states, 2/3 to pass amendments of the Constitution and then ratification by 3/4 of the states. What those numbers come out to is 67 U.S. senators, 290 U.S. representatives, and 38 states. Those are pretty big numbers. But the great thing is that depending on how you measure it, we've already come 1/3 of the way there in just 3.5 years. There are currently 28 U.S. senators, more than 1/3 of 67, who have co-sponsored amendment bills to overturn Citizens United. There are 97 House members, which is 1/3 of 290, including Congresswoman Eshoo, I'm happy to say, who have courageously stood up and co-sponsored amendment bills calling to overturn Citizens United. There are now 14 states, which is more than 1/3 of 38, that have formally called for an amendment, most of them by passing state legislative resolutions, including California, calling for an amendment to overturn Citizens United. The other states that have done so are Colorado, Connecticut, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Maryland, Montana, New Jersey, New Mexico, Rhode Island, Vermont, West Virginia, and just yesterday, the 14th state, Illinois. Just yesterday. Of those states, almost all of them acted through their legislatures. But last November, on Election Day, 2 states, Colorado and Montana, held statewide popular votes on the question of supporting a constitutional amendment. And as Ted mentioned, he stole one of my best lines, they both voted by 74%. That's nearly 3-to-1 popular votes calling for constitutional amendments to make it clear that corporations do not have constitutional rights as if they were people. That's, again, a margin of almost 3-to-1. In the same vein, the voters of Los Angeles, just a week and a half ago, at the same time as they elected a new mayor, also voted by more than 3-to-1 to call for an amendment. Los Angeles is now one of nearly 500 states, cities, and counties across the country that have made that call. But there's another important point about Montana that Ted also touched on that I want to come back to, which is probably the most important point of all. When you consider how polarized this country is, how divided our government is, how paralyzed our government is, and then you consider that everything that we're unable to do in Washington today is blocked at lower thresholds than even those we need to achieve for an amendment. If you consider the level of supermajorities that we need to accomplish for an amendment, 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states, there's really no way ultimately to get there without real bipartisan support, such as our polling shows. And that is why it's so incredibly heartening to see that Montana voted 3-to-1 for a constitutional amendment while also voting for Mitt Romney by more than 10 points. It just proves beyond any doubt that the American people are ready to stand up and demand this change. Across party lines, everyone wants this. So now it really is just a matter of getting the rest of our elected representatives on board. And with your help, that is what we're setting out to do. Thank you very much.